to our origin of We the People. Tackling current issues, both political and legal, with common sense. As We the People, we must bring common sense back to make our lives better. Only on NowMedia TV.
Good evening, America, and welcome to We the People. I'm Alina Gonzalez Dockry. Tonight, we're going to be talking about something Americans are starving for right now. And it's not outrage. It's not further division, not another manufactured political war, but solutions. I'm talking about real solutions. Because somewhere along the way, America became addicted to conflict. Every issue becomes a political combat. Every disagreement becomes a personal destruction. And every political policy discussion becomes less about helping we, the American people, more about humiliating the other side. And frankly, people, I know I am, are exhausted. We are exhausted from the noise, exhausted from the tribalism that we are witnessing on a constant 24-hour sessions, exhausted from watching leaders spend more time attacking one another than addressing the issues that are crushing working Americans every single day. But tonight, we may actually be witnessing something different. Something that reminds us what this country is capable of when leadership becomes bigger than ego. I know it sounds amazing. President Donald Trump and billionaire entrepreneur Mark Cuban, two men who have publicly disagreed politically for years, are now working together on a prescription drug initiative aimed at lowering medication costs for Americans. Now think about that for a moment. A Republican president, a businessman who openly opposed him politically, even endorsed his opponent in the last election, Kamala Harris. We are witnessing government and private industry coming together for the better good of all Americans, working together. And it's not because they suddenly agree on everything, but because Americans are hurting. And honestly, this should not be newsworthy. This shouldn't even be commentary worthy. But it is inspiring. And it shows there is hope. Because this country was never designed around ideological purity. The founders 250 years ago argued fiercely. They disagreed passionately. They competed over ideas constantly, but ultimately government was supposed to function for the benefit of the people. Somewhere along the way, especially recently, we lost that. Everything became permanent warfare. Everything became performance. Get those little viral clips. Everything became about defeating the other side instead of serving we, the American people. So let's talk about what this actually is. The Trump RX initiative is essentially designed to create a large-scale prescription pricing marketplace that allows Americans access to lower-cost medications through direct pricing, transparency, competition, and partnerships with companies willing to challenge the traditional pharmaceutical pricing structure. And now Mark Cuban's Cost Plus Drugs company is becoming part of that effort. That matters because Cuban's company operates very differently than the traditional system Americans have been trapped inside for decades. Instead of hidden pricing structures, background negotiations, and layers of middlemen, the model is based on transparency. The actual manufacturing cost of the drug, a modest markup, a pharmacy fee, shipping costs. Simple, straightforward, transparent. And let's be honest, transparency is exactly what the healthcare industry has avoided for years. Americans can shop online for airfare. We can compare mortgage rates. We can price vehicles, auto insurance, electronics, even groceries to get a better price. But somehow, when it comes to life-saving medications, Americans are often left completely in the dark and at the behest of what the pharmaceutical and insurance companies allow. Prices vary wildly. Insurance companies deny coverage. I know I've had many of mine denied, and I don't know why. Pharmacy benefit managers take massive cuts, and patients are left standing at pharmacy counters shocked by costs they never saw coming. And this issue becomes very real very quickly. I have a personal friend who is diabetic, and he uses Ozempic. It's not for weight loss. He uses it to manage his diabetes, and his medication refuses to cover it. Before using Trump RX, he was paying nearly $800 plus a month out of pocket. $800. Now think about how many Americans are quietly living that every single month. People are trying to survive. People trying to stay healthy. People trying to take care of their families while wondering how they're going to afford medication they literally need to live. But through this new pricing structure going through Trump RX, his monthly cost dropped to approximately $450 to $499. Now, let me be clear. That is still very expensive, especially for something that is prescribed by a doctor to help manage his diabetes. But saving that $300 a month can absolutely change someone's life. That can go to rent money. That's groceries, paying car insurance. That's the difference between panic and breathing room for many American families. And this is where Washington often loses the American people. Politicians debate the ideology. Media outlets debate narratives. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens, you and I, are asking much simpler questions. Can I afford my medication this month? Can I take care of my family? Can I serve on this economy? Those are not Republican questions. Those are not Democrat questions. Those are questions made by American families and individuals around this country. And what fascinates me about this story is watching how uncomfortable some parts of the media seem to be with it. They're actually incredulous that this is happening, because this partnership disrupts the modern political script. We've spent years being told that political opponents must be enemies, that compromise is weakness, that cooperation is betrayal. But what happens when people from completely different political viewpoints, such as Trump and Cuban, actually work together on a problem affecting hundreds of millions of Americans? What happens when results start mattering more than political branding? And maybe that's the deeper lesson here. America works best when innovation, government, and leadership from different perspectives come together to solve real problems, not perform for cameras, not fuel outrage, not build media clips and social influencing points, but solve real problems. And frankly, Americans are desperate to see that again. Now, does this solve every problem in American healthcare? Absolutely not. There are legitimate questions about long-term implementation, access, pricing scope, insurance integration, and whether the system can truly compete against entrenched pharmaceutical interests. Those are fair concerns. And serious policy discussions should include serious scrutiny. But leadership is not about waiting for perfection before taking action. Leadership is about movement. It is about innovation. It is about trying to improve people's lives. And perhaps most importantly, this moment reminds us of something this country desperately needs to remember. We do not have to agree on everything to work together on something. That is not weakness. That is a sign of maturity, leadership, and it is how nations move forward. Because at the end of the day, Americans do not care whose idea it was if it helps them survive. And maybe just maybe, the future of this country depends on rediscovering that simple truth. What is it like for America when our leaders actually care more about what is in the best interest of this country and how to move forward and figuring out what they have more in common than apart? I think they can move mountains. I have stated that, and that's been the position of we the people. Common sense leadership, governance, cooperation. Nobody agrees 100% of the time with 100% of the issues. But I assure you, one issue at a time, if you can find common ground, can move towards that goal. Mark Cuban, he was one of the loudest opponents to Trump. And now here he is actually on stage stating that this is a good cooperative collaboration. So when we come back, what exactly is Trump RX? How does the pricing system work? Why are pharmaceutical middlemen suddenly under pressure? And could this become a blueprint for broader healthcare reform in America? Stay with us. This is We the People. Welcome back to We the People. Tonight, we're examining the growing partnership between Trump RX and entrepreneur Mark Cuban's Cost Plus Drugs initiative. And more importantly, what this entire conversation reveals about the broken system Americans have been trapped inside for years. Because the deeper you look into prescription drug pricing in America, the more one question keeps surfacing. How did we get here? How did the wealthiest nation on earth become a country where senior citizens ration insulin, where diabetics skip medication, where families crowdsource healthcare online, where Americans routinely pay 2, 3, sometimes even 10 times more for the exact same medication sold overseas? And perhaps the more uncomfortable question is this: who exactly has been benefiting from that system? Because most Americans assume the problem starts and ends with pharmaceutical manufacturers. But the reality is far more complicated. Between the drug manufacturer and the patient stands an enormous network of insurance companies, pharmacy benefit managers, known as PBMs, distributors, negotiations, rebates, pricing contracts, and corporate intermediaries. And by the time that medication finally reaches the patient, the price has often exploded. Now, for viewers watching tonight who may never have heard the term PBM, let me explain why this matters. Pharmacy benefit managers were originally created to help negotiate lower drug costs. But over time, critics argue many of these companies evolved into powerful middlemen controlling which medications are covered, which pharmacies patients can use, what prices are negotiated, and ultimately what Americans pay at the counter. And here's the problem. The system became so opaque that many Americans have absolutely no idea why their medication costs what it costs. One patient may pay $40 for a medication. Another may pay $400 for the very same medication. Another may be denied completely because their insurance doesn't cover it or they do not have the funds to pay for it. We're talking about the same medication. We're talking about the same country, good old US of A, completely different outcomes and experiences. And we Americans are expected to simply accept that as normal. That's why the Trump RX and Cost Plus model is generating so much attention. Because whether people politically like Donald Trump or dislike him, And trust me, it seems like that is a schism on its own. Whether you support or like Mark Cuban or disagree with him, the partnership is challenging one of the most protected systems in modern American healthcare. And that is hidden pricing. Transparency changes everything. When we Americans can actually compare prices, when patients can bypass layers of bureaucracy and red tape, when consumers can see what medications really cost, suddenly the healthcare conversation becomes less about political slogans and more about accountability. And again, I go back to my friend using Ozempic. Before this program, he was paying nearly $800 a month because insurance refused coverage. Now, through Trump RX pricing access, the cost dropped by approximately $300. And though paying almost $500 out of pocket is not cheap, it's still a step forward. And no serious person would argue that Americans shouldn't continue demanding lower prices, especially when we look at what the cost of these same medications are being sold in other countries or other continents like Europe. But that $300 reduction is meaningful, because if you are someone who is living paycheck to paycheck, a $300 savings is not abstract economics. It's survival. And this is where I believe America is reaching a breaking point. People are tired of systems that feel designed against them. They're tired of feeling powerless. They're tired of watching massive industries report billions in profits while ordinary citizens struggle to afford basic health care or even basic medicines to maintain their health. And yet, what fascinates me most is how quickly some people immediately try to force every issue back into political tribalism. The we against them, the conservative, the progressive, the Republican, the Democrat, blue versus red. If Trump supports it, some people automatically oppose it, and it can't be good, and we're going to do everything we can to fight what might be a good thing. If Mark Cuban supports it, others become suspicious or angry that he's actually supporting something that Trump initiated. But the better question is why? Why are we doing that to ourselves? Why have Americans been conditioned to reject solutions, be it simply because of who delivers them? This country cannot survive if ideology becomes more important than outcomes. And frankly, I think most of us, most Americans, understand that instinctively. The average citizen does not wake up every morning thinking, how can I defend my political tribe today and make sure that our voices are heard and we obstruct anything that the opposing party does? I don't. And I do political analysis as part of my career. But I think American average citizen is waking up thinking, how do I take care of my family? How do I ensure that my family thrives or even just basically survives? Because that's real life. Our founding fathers understood something we seem to be forgetting in modern America. A functioning republic requires disagreement, but even more importantly, it requires cooperation. It requires people mature enough to say, I may disagree with you on 10 issues, but on issue number 11, if it helps the American people, let's work together. That's not surrender. That's statesmanship. And healthcare costs are not just a medical issue anymore. They're an economic issue, a national security issue, a middle-class survival issue. Because when millions of Americans cannot afford medication, the consequences ripple across the entire economy. Lost productivity, higher emergency care costs, financial collapses for families, and growing distrust in institutions. And maybe that's why this story resonates so deeply right now, because Americans are desperate for evidence that their leaders are still capable of solving problems instead of simply manufacturing outrage. Now, let's be fair. Critics argue Trump RX is still limited in scope, and it is. Some analysts question whether these savings can scale nationally. Others argue that broader healthcare reform is still necessary, which is absolutely true. These are all legitimate discussions. But innovation almost always starts imperfectly. The real question is whether America is finally willing to challenge systems that have gone unquestioned for far too long. And that's what it is. It's not even just the questioning these systems like medical care, health insurance, access to proper medication. It also begs the question, is our leadership that seems to be almost on remote renewal and winning elections, are they capable? Are they worthy of our continued support based on the fact that they seem to be incapable or unwilling to even broach topics, debate, and see where common ground may reign? And I'm talking about not only the healthcare issues, it goes far beyond that. We are deserving of governing leaders that put our interests before their own. We are deserving of having leaders willing to go to bat against bigger corporations or bigger lobbying groups to say enough is enough, let's find common ground and let's build upon that. Much like in our families, where not everybody agrees 100% of the time, and you're going to get in those debates and you're going to get into probably some fights, but usually there's always some foundational pieces that people can say, you know what? I may not agree with you on X, Y, Z, but on A, B, I do. And let's see what we can do building on A, B. That's what's happening between Trump RX and Mark Cuban's company. And perhaps that's something that we'll see more of. People willing to step out of their comfort zones or their ideological, political zones and see what is in the best nature. And when we come back, we're going to examine the political fallout surrounding this partnership. Why does bipartisan cooperation make so many people feel uncomfortable? Why does the media struggle to cover stories that don't fit the outrage narrative? And is America finally reaching a point where citizens care more about solutions than party labels? Stay with us. This is We the People. Welcome back to We the People. Tonight, we've been discussing the Trump RX initiative and the partnership between President Trump and entrepreneur Mark Cuban. Two people with very different political perspectives coming together around one issue affecting millions of Americans, healthcare costs. And whether people politically like both men or not is almost beside the point. Because what we really stands out is that cooperation happened at all. And despite the political warfare Americans constantly see online and on television, this is not the only example of bipartisan cooperation happening in America right now. In fact, Congress has quietly passed several bipartisan, that means Republicans and Democrats working together to pass several measures recently with overwhelming support from both parties. Let's talk about the Take It Down Act. The Take It Down Act became law this year, criminalizing the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, including AI-generated deep fakes, and requiring online platforms to remove that material quickly. And frankly, this issue affects everybody. Parents are worried about it. Young people are vulnerable to it. Any one of us could be a victim of this, especially with the AI generations. Technology is evolving faster than the law. And in this instant, lawmakers from both parties, both Republicans and Democrats, recognized that we Americans needed protections, and they acted together to pass that. That was just a blip on the news thing. Here's another example. We're also seeing bipartisan cooperation on housing. The 21st Century Road to Housing Act advanced through the Senate with overwhelming bipartisan support, alongside related health legislation focused on increasing housing supply, reforming zoning barriers, and addressing affordability challenges facing working Americans. Again, not a partisan issue. Americans across the political spectrum are struggling with housing costs. Healthcare legislation. We've also seen bipartisan healthcare legislation focus on expanding access to care, strengthening the medical workforce, and addressing rising healthcare costs, which brings us full circle to tonight's broader healthcare discussion. And recently, Congress overwhelmingly supported legislation increasing disability compensation and dependency benefits for veterans and their families, for those that have served in our United States military forces. Because taking care of the men and women who serve our country should not become ideological warfare. And I want to bring up what Senator Rick Scott, Republican Senator of Florida, working alongside Democratic lawmakers on bipartisan disaster relief legislation that passed unanimously in the House of Representatives, helping Americans recover from hurricanes, wildfires, and federally declared disasters, and also reaping certain tax credits and benefits. Let me say that again. It passed unanimously in the House of Representatives. To me, that should be shouted from the tops of the mountains. That should be on every single newspaper front page, or news website, I should say. It should be announced in Fox, CNN, MSNBC, and all the likes. You know how I learned about this? Because I read it in an email newsletter and I had to look it up. In today's political climate, seeing the House of Representatives come together unanimously to pass something that is clearly for the benefit of the Americans, and that this, and let's face it, Senator Rick Scott, he is a hard right person. I've had him as a governor. He is a U.S. senator. But for him to work closely with a counterpart Democratic senator and U.S. representative to try to pass this bill to provide disaster relief, that goes beyond the party. That goes beyond the blinders that some people put. That is actually putting forth we the people first and foremost. So here's the question I keep coming back to. If bipartisan cooperation is still happening, why do Americans feel like it isn't? And honestly, I believe the answer is pretty obvious. Because conflict has become more profitable than cooperation. Outrage drives ratings. Anger drives the clicks. Social media algorithms reward emotional reaction. Cable news thrives on confrontation because it also drives viewers, which drives sponsorship dollars. And calm, functional governance simply doesn't not generate the same attention as political chaos. It definitely doesn't draw enough fundraising dollars. Like I said, both parties, both sides, conservatives, liberals, progressives, communists, socialists, Republicans, Democrats, they all go on the same manifesto, and that is a monarchy of fear. Place fear, chaos, rage to the people. Also is how it keeps us divided, or so it seems, superficially. It keeps us in a moment of always of unrest. But here's some proof that legislatures can actually do their job. Now, those are just a few. Now I'm going to see if I can find some more. So Americans end up consuming a version of reality where it feels like everybody hates each other all the time. Republican versus Democrats, red states versus blue states, North versus South, as though Americans are no longer capable of functioning together as one country. And frankly, some political rhetoric today is making the situation worse. Recently, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, better known as AOC, called for the North to essentially politically mobilize against Southern states. And she specifically named Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina. And you got to think, what the heck was she trying to invoke there? Now, whether people agree with her politics or not is not even the central issue. What concerns me is the framing itself. Because once American leaders begin speaking about the country as competing regions that need to politically confront one another, North versus South, bringing the New York to Alabama and the likes of Tennessee and the Southern states, or the NAACP now calling for young Black athletes to boycott ACC teams and turn down their NIL money and their scholarship and stuff, to show the South a lesson. What's that? That is not progress. That is digression. And we are entering very dangerous territory culturally. And honestly, it starts echoing the kind of regional hostility this country experienced before the Civil War. And I'm not saying we are on the verge of war itself, but because the language of division becomes normalized. And once citizens begin viewing fellow Americans primarily as enemies instead of countrymen, neighbors, the social fabric of the nation begins eroding very quickly. America cannot function long-term as 50 states emotionally and politically at war with one another. Yes, different states have different cultures, and that is a beautiful thing. Each state has different priorities. And each state has different political beliefs. Each state is as unique as you and I are. And that has always been true since the inception of this country 250 years ago when we won our independence from England. But healthcare costs affect all Americans. Housing costs affect all Americans. Natural disasters affect all Americans. Economic pressure affects all Americans. These are not Southern problems. These are not Northern problems. These are American problems. And this is exactly why examples like Trump RX and the bipartisan legislation matter, because they remind Americans that adults with very different viewpoints are still capable of sitting at the same table and working on real problems. And honestly, I think part of the reason cooperation feels so unusual now is because our culture increasingly struggles with disagreement itself. We see it everywhere. On college campuses, speakers are shouted down before they can even finish a sentence. Online, disagreements instantly escalate into insults and personal attacks. Someone voices an opposing opinion, and suddenly they're labeled hateful, dangerous, ignorant, or evil. And frankly, it's becoming intellectually lazy, because disagreement is supposed to happen in a free society. The problem is not disagreement itself. The problem is that too many people no longer know how to disagree without becoming emotionally reactive. Not every disagreement is hate. Not every opposing opinion is violence. And not every political difference requires emotional collapse. And what concerns me most is that we are increasingly rewarding reaction instead of critical thinking. Instant outrage, instant judgment, instant condemnation, but very little listening, very little discussion, and very little curiosity about why somebody may see the world differently. You cannot govern a country if every disagreement becomes moral condemnation. At some point, adults have to sit across from people they disagree with, argue through ideas intelligently, negotiate outcomes, and move the country forward. That is how functioning societies operate. And that is how, up until, I don't know, let's just say 235 years ago, we have been able to do. And maybe that's what we, the people, is really supposed to mean. So we're going to take a quick commercial break. Stay tuned and come back to We the People. Welcome back to We the People. You know, if someone only consumed politics through social media clips, cable news arguments, and online outrage, they would probably walk away believing Americans are no longer capable of working together at all. That every issue is now a political war, that every disagreement is personal, that compromise is dead, and that the country is permanently divided into hostile camps that can no longer function together. But history actually tells a very different story. Take Ronald Reagan and Democratic Speaker Tip O'Neill. Politically, they fought constantly. Taxes, government spending, economics policy, foreign policy. They disagreed on major issues shaping the country at that time in the 80s. And yet, after battling publicly during the day, the two men could still sit down privately, talk, negotiate, and ultimately govern. Why? Because they understood something many leaders today seem to forget. You cannot run a country entirely through outrage. And honestly, that's part of what feels different now. Too much of modern politics is no longer about governing. It's about performance. Performance for cameras, performance for social media, performance for fundraising, performance for those viral moments, performance for your own branding. Everything becomes about emotional reaction instead of long-term solutions. The Civil Rights Act didn't happen because everybody suddenly agreed overnight. It happened because people from different political parties, different regions, and different backgrounds ultimately recognized that the country could not continue moving forward without addressing a serious national issue. That required difficult conversations, huge political risk, negotiations, compromising. In other words, leadership. Even during the 1990s, President Bill Clinton and Republican Speaker Newt Gingrich publicly battled one another relentlessly. But despite the conflict, they still worked together on welfare reform and balancing the federal budget. Again, not because they suddenly were singing Kumbaya and became ideological allies, because governing still mattered over political ideology. Post 9/11, almost 25 years ago, the terrorist attack of September 11th occurred. And afterwards, Americans from every political ideology, every background stood together as Americans first. Not Republicans first, not Democrats first, Americans. The country understood that some moments were bigger than party identity, that some moments were bigger than the individual's opinions or disgruntledness towards others, because it was an attack on the people and we had to forge together. And that's why tonight's conversation matters, because what we discussed this evening were real, modern examples showing that cooperation still exists in this country, even if it no longer dominates the headlines. A Republican president partnering with a businessman who openly opposed him politically to address healthcare costs. That's moving the needle forward. Congress passing bipartisan legislation involving veterans benefits, housing affordability, healthcare access, AI deepfake protections, and disaster relief. Those are not theoretical examples. They are happening right now. And frankly, I think most Americans are far less interested in political tribal warfare than the media ecosystem would have people believe. The average citizen is not waking up every morning hoping elected officials insult one another more creatively online. People want competence. They want leaders capable of solving problems. I think the greatest, and I said this before, Senator John Fetterman. He continues to amaze me and surprise me. And oftentimes, I think he is also really one of the few voices of reason on Capitol Hill. Because while politicians and media personalities spend hours fueling outrage cycles, ordinary Americans are trying to navigate real life. We're trying to afford groceries. Some are trying to buy homes. Some are trying to keep their homes. Trying to pay medical bills. Trying to rebuild after disasters. Trying to raise families in an economy that feels increasingly unstable. And most people do not care whether a good solution comes from a Republican, a Democrat, a conservative, or a progressive, if it actually improves their lives. And maybe that's where the disconnect between political culture and ordinary citizens becomes most obvious, because too much of modern politics rewards the appearance of fighting more than the results of governing. Because let's face it, if you're looking for something interesting to watch, watching Congress actually doing its job of governance and passing legislation that benefits the American people, it doesn't get the clicks. And that's unfortunate. It's not the dopamine hit that so many people have become used to. But think about it this way. A bipartisan bill quietly helping veterans, those who served for our country, those who put their lives, their well-being on the line, barely got covered. Lawmakers working together on housing affordability, minimal attention. Disaster relief legislation passing unanimously, 100% of the House of Representatives voted for this. And most Americans never hear about it. But one outrageous comment online, one political insult, one representative behind the glass on a stage yelling, we have to bring the North to the South, bring the New York to the Alabama. Now that's viral. That catches attention. That dominates the national conversation for days. And that ensures the money of fundraisers keeps coming in. And over time, that kind of environment distorts how Americans begin viewing one another. People start seeing fellow citizens primarily through political labels instead of as neighbors, co-workers, classmates, or Americans sharing the same country. Oftentimes, that rhetoric, that fueling of the anger and the negativity and the hatred among people have destroyed families. And once politics becomes identity first and citizenship second, the culture starts becoming extremely unstable. Because functioning democracies require people capable of doing something very basic: disagreeing without treating one another like enemies. We do not have to agree on everything. Cooperating, finding middle ground is not abandoning principles. And to think that this could be a utopian world of la, 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 pretending differences do not exist is not going to help our country either. But still recognizing that a country, especially one this large and this diverse, cannot function if compromise becomes politically impossible is the biggest farce. And maybe that's what we the people is really supposed to mean. Not that Americans all think the same. Not that we all come from the same background. Not that every region views the world identically. But that despite these differences, we still share responsibility for the future of the same country. And frankly, I think Americans themselves now have to decide what kind of political culture they want to reward moving forward, because leadership responds to incentives. If outrage generates attention, outrage will continue. If division generates power, division will continue. If performance becomes more valuable than governing, then performance is exactly what politics will produce. But if Americans begin rewarding seriousness, competence, problem solving, and leaders willing to work across disagreement when necessary, then the political culture, the game changes too. And that does not mean eliminating disagreement. Disagreement is healthy. Debate is healthy. Strong opinions are healthy. What is unhealthy is this culture where every disagreement immediately becomes hostility and every political issue becomes tribal warfare. Because at the end of the day, the success of this country has never depended on everybody agreeing. It depended on whether Americans remain capable of functioning together despite our disagreement. History shows us we have done that time and time again. The real question now is whether we still have the maturity as citizens and as leaders to do it again. I'm Alina Gonzalez Dockry. This has been We the People. Good night, America.